that I have found that addresses the program more in line with what we do than anybody else in this city. And it's always been that way, that Brother Professor Amos Wilson and myself, one of our things in criticizing the others is they don't talk economics. They want to talk everything else but that. So it's a great pleasure to be with him tonight, Professor Amos Wilson.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you kindly. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to share this time with you and to be invited to be with you. And I'd like to thank you for coming out in spite of all the dire predictions of the weather and so forth. And just in sort of keeping the faith, I'd like to also thank those of you who have supported African World Info Systems in buying our publications. Our book, Falsification, is doing quite well along with the other books, and we appreciate that very much. We want to let you know, of course, that the sales from our books are not personally used by myself, and when I say us, I'm talking about Brother Sababu Plata, who's my main partner there, myself, of course, and Sister Dorothy Lewis, and others who support us at African World Info Systems. The chief purpose is to distribute information and to provide the necessary information and analysis to advance our interest as a people. We're going to talk a little bit about economics this evening. Of course, we don't have as much time as we would need. This would take quite a bit of time. Hopefully, though, I've been promising to do a series on Black Power. I have to announce again that we do expect to get our book out, A Blueprint for Black Power, in March. It started out as a project for writing 10 lectures. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the one, you'll be the judge of that, it has ballooned up to about 600 pages. So it's one reason why we've been a bit delayed. So I think when we get to it, the final editing, it'll be somewhere between 400 and 500 pages. And even with that, we are skimming the surface of the things that we need to know. I've stated in other contexts, we brag a great deal about how the Egyptian priests were educated for 40 years, and yet we think that we can accomplish the education we need for nationhood and power, meeting 2 hours every weekend. In a nation that is on top today, that has respect today, is a nation that takes great time in educating its leaders and in educating its important citizens. That 40-year education was not just unique to Egypt, it happens today. If you go through a full, say, PhD program, it's easy for you to spend 40 years getting educated. Even if you don't, if you get a master's, a BA, or you don't even get that, it still may take you 40 years to be truly educated and to get some sense of how the world operates and to learn the methods and the means for dealing with the world. I've indicated in other contexts as well that every culture has its unique time dimension. And one of the problems that we have today is the fact that we have not yet applied African time to our own processes as a people. I've indicated that our children are being destroyed in these schools in terms of the time system alone, let alone all the other things that are going on there. But because the time system that is being used there has been inherited from another people. We say that they go into the schools with different motivations from the standard population. We say that they may come from various home backgrounds and economic backgrounds, with various psychological orientations toward the world and so forth and so on, with a different mission to achieve in life and this and that. And then in the name of equal education, we want them to get over all of this to learn exactly what the others learned within the same period of time given to the others. And when they do not learn what we think they should, or we've been told that they should learn, we're ready then to talk about them in terms of learning deficiencies and in need of special education and all of the other kinds of things we hear out here every day. Instead of reconstructing the time system in terms of who they are and what they have to accomplish as a people. To the topic at hand, I would agree with Dr. Amos that in a sense, in terms of the topic of this evening's session, we are all for those titles. You've heard me say, of course, that in order for us to be in the condition we are in as people, we have to be out of our minds. It is a political and economic necessity. It is mandatory. And I'm not being rhetorical when I make that statement. We are a rich people, and yet we perceive ourselves as poverty-stricken. But our richness is not as much in our lands as in another place. The ultimate wealth of a people is in their head, in their heads, not even in their soils. What do we mean by that? We mean by that the kind of situation we see today, where the people who have the natural wealth in their lands are starving and do not own those lands. And yet people who did not have the lands, did not own the lands, are in control of those lands and in control of the wealth. I've often said somewhat facetiously that perhaps Africans would have been better off economically, politically, and otherwise had we not had the wealth in the African soil. Then we would have been forced to use our minds. The Japanese have no wealth in their soils. They have no natural minerals or anything else. In an objective sense, we should call the Japanese a very dependent nation, but their dependency has not made them poor. They make the people who supply them, make them wealthy. Because of what? Because of the consciousness that they project in the world. When you have the right mind, you can con people out of their wealth. You don't have to have any land if you're smart enough to talk other people out of theirs or take other people's lands. In other words, then, the ultimate determiner of wealth and power in the world is the mind of the human being. And that is why, then, we are poverty-stricken, not because we have not been blessed with wealth, but because we have been robbed of our greatest wealth, which is our mentality and our consciousness as a people. We would have to be out of our minds to be in the condition that we are in today, and to be dealing with almost a total reversal of reality that we deal with today, where those who own least, who were given least by nature, are in control of the most, and those who were given most have the least. This can only occur when the minds of those who have least have been twisted and turned backwards, and their consciousness falsified. We are not a dependent people, even though we think we are. We've been made to believe we are. And yet, when we talk about our stolen wealth, we're talking about other people who depend on it. When we talk about our enslavement, we're talking about people who depend on our labor. When we talk about the $300 billion or more that we earn, We talk about people who have enriched themselves in terms of how we spend that money. People whose first beeline is to the poor African community in America to enrich themselves. We are still America's greatest wealth-producing population right now. The issue is not so much what we earn, for if we earn 300 billion, then we must produce trillions, because in a capitalist system, you only get a fraction in terms of earning of what you produce. So we're getting paid 300 billion. We must be producing well over $1 trillion, which would mean, ladies and gentlemen, that African people in America are one of the world's largest economies. We marvel because a Mike Tyson earns $20 million for a fight without recognizing that if a Mike Tyson is earning that, the fight itself is generating $200 million. And yet we don't ask ourselves, where is the other 180 million? We marvel about some athlete earning 10 or 15 million a year. Well, if that's the case, then that athlete must be worth to his owners $100 million, $150 million a year. We don't ask ourselves what happens to those other hundreds of millions of dollars. We marvel about a Michael Jackson or someone else who's earned 60 or 70 or $100 million. And yet we do not recognize that the American music industry is probably the largest, second largest export industry that this country has. We think of music as purely entertainment, but music is a commodity. Black music sells about 60% of the music sold in the world. It outsells other people's native music. It is worth billions of dollars. And yet we're willing to sing for pennies a record. And we're willing to give away our major cultural product to other people. We trade far more money with this nation than Canada. Don't be deceived because Canada is a large territory, that it therefore is worth more money to the United States than are black people. We have worth far more money to this nation than is Mexico, even with the NAFTA agreement. Do not again be deceived because it represents a large land mass. We are to a great extent America's wealth. However, that is rapidly coming to an end. And if we do not transform ourselves within the next 5 to 10 years, we will go into almost irreversible decline and perhaps genocidal demise. We do not have much time, ladies and gentlemen. The nature of the world is changing so rapidly and dynamically. We can no longer debate year in and year out about which way we are going. We must now not only think locally, but we have to think globally. Because the very nature of our local circumstances are being transformed by international circumstances. When you look out of this building and you walk out of these streets and you see Asians, you see Koreans, Arabs, others, this is the result of global changes in the world. People who are running away from the dislocations in their own economies coming here to America. We are looking at a situation here where the world is being transformed and a new world government is coming into being, where sovereign nations will no longer exist. If you have a bit of time, you should investigate the NAFTA agreements and the so-called GATT agreements. Not only does the so-called NAFTA Accord threaten to further unemploy African American people, But the NAFTA Accords are a major step to where this nation, along with other nations, will cease to operate as sovereign nations within themselves, where the world essentially will be run by corporations, by a small group of white males with an intermix of Asian males, and perhaps a third level of Latino males, but principally European and Asian males who are already setting the world up. Take a little time and investigate the so-called side agreements that were passed over quickly when the discussion about NAFTA took place. What are those side agreements? Why were they not discussed? Why was it required that NAFTA be passed as a whole piece rather than to be debated and passed upon piece by piece? In other words, the U.S. Congress itself of the sovereign United States was told that you must take the whole agreement or none of it. You have no right to take it apart and say, I don't like this or I don't like that, therefore I will not agree with this or I will not agree with that. No, they were told you've got to take the whole thing or nothing at all, and you've got to do it by a particular period of time, which meant, ladies and gentlemen, that the so-called citizens of the United States, through their elected representatives, lost all right to really debate a major economic agreement that would transform their economic and political circumstances. It meant then that the United States courts and other United States tribunals and bodies could not pass upon legislation that would transform the economic atmosphere and transform the whole geography of the nation. Those people whose jobs would be destroyed, those people whose jobs would be exported, would have nothing to say through their representatives about an agreement that was doing this to them. Some of the side agreements indicate that the rules about trade and differences concerning trade would not be arbitrated in the courts of the United States, would not be arbitrated in the Supreme Court, or would not be arbitrated in the legislatures of the United States, would be arbitrated by an international tribunal in secret session. And the ruling of these tribunals would supersede the ruling of the nations themselves. So consequently then, the so-called governmental agencies that you think you're voting for and that you think are representing your interests will not be able to rule in your favor in terms of the ruling and the arbitrations of these tribunals. So what do we have going on here? A structuring of the world by corporate elites. Because in whose interest is the GATT agreement operating? Who will be doing the trading? You, me, or the corporations? So whose agreements and who is agreeing? We are dealing with Mexico, which is run by about 17 families. An oligarchy, not a democracy. An oligarchy that was embarrassed here last week by that area that is soon going to be taken over by a small group of people. That area whose lands will be ripped out from under the natives so that they may enter into a trade with the elites in America. If you had a chance, did you check out the GATT agreements? Another interesting thing there too. And really check out the struggle that went on between France and the United States that people thought were trivial, where the United States was literally telling France, look, our movies sell well in France. Our movies sell better than the French movies do. Why not give up your industry? Forget about French culture. Buy American culture. We deliver it to you for a cheaper price. Why not give your consumers what they want? And the French said no. But they're telling the French, you have no right to subsidize your cultural industries or to subsidize your actors and actresses and so forth. The only right you have to do is to swing your doors open and let your nation be flooded by American products. But even more ominous was the struggle between the French and the Americans over farming. The French who are subsidizing their farmers, maintaining their farmers. The United States tell them, you have no right to subsidize your farmers. You must create an open and free market. And if the farm products of the United States are much cheaper than the farm products produced by French farmers, then too bad. If it means ultimately that France would have no farmers, so what? It's better for the world. You should buy U.S. food. What kind of nation, even if it has to pay more for its food, would decide to give up a very basic industry like farming and place its very livelihood and place its provisioning in terms of food in the hands of the international market? Only a Negro nation would do that. And the French told them, we're not going to do it. The same struggle went on with the Japanese. The United States saying what? Throw your farmers out of business. We have cheaper rice. And the Japanese saying, but we value our farmers and we value their being employed. What difference does it make? We are talking about a free trade system here. And if people are thrown out of business, so be it. And so these are the things that are occurring behind so-called GATT agreements, behind NAFTA agreements, and other agreements. And it is time, African ladies and gentlemen, that you begin to study these issues simply because they are talks between white men and so forth and Asian men, and simply because the terms may not be readily familiar does not mean that they have nothing to do with you. They have everything to do with you. You must recognize that with these so-called agreements, Africa and African people are being isolated out of the world markets. For instance, in this GATT agreement, the people who run the textile industries in South Carolina and in North Carolina, the industries where some of your relatives, I'm sure, may be employed, an industry that employs a large number of African Americans. These people who ran those industries had to struggle with the American negotiators to protect those textile mills for another 10 years. But after 10 years, the agreement is that the textiles from China and other parts of the world will be permitted a free-flowing market in America, and therefore the American textile industry will probably disappear to be around no longer. And that means the African Americans and other people who are employed in those industries will be unemployed. In fact, many of the industries that will be wiped out by so-called free trade are the very industries where the bulk of African Americans are employed today and at this moment. So these are not abstract talks between white men and Asian men and other men. These are talks that have direct effects on our lives as a people. And we should know what they are. It is a shame anyway that we let people who are less than 5% of the globe determine the economic destiny of the globe. That a bunch of men who call themselves men, black men who call themselves men, but who are at heart total cowards, would let another bunch of white boys determine their economic destiny. Have meetings among themselves and determine how we shall live. What group of real men have their highest aspirations as that involving being employed by the men of another ethnic group. It is an amazing situation that black men have seen themselves as the permanent second bananas of white men who are getting angry. You hear a book out here now talked about the anger of the successful Negroes. You know, you should be angry. You should be angry with yourself. You are angry because the white boys are not letting you in. What a shame. Why aren't you creating your own industries? But let's look again at the NAFTA. Where were the Afro-Caribbean nations in that agreement? Where were the African nations during that agreement? Let's look at the GATT agreements. Where does Africa fit in those agreements? What you have going on here, ladies and gentlemen, is almost a total isolation of African people across the whole diaspora. You have a NAFTA agreement, which is essentially a club between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And the members of this club are giving each other special privileges. Privileges that will be denied other people who are not members of the club. They will get special discounts, access to special markets, special protections, special financing, and other kinds of things because they're a member of the NAFTA club. And yet we see no African nations and no people who are part of that. You talk about trading with Africa. You talk about trading with the Caribbean nations. What is going to happen when you decide to trade with the Caribbean nations and trade with the African nations and find out that you cannot enter into the kind of trade you want to because the methods you have chosen to trade run against the NAFTA agreements? That the United States has agreed with the Mexicans or agreed with the Canadians that certain products outside of their club cannot be imported into the country. Or that products that are imported into the country must be taxed in some special sort of way. And yet you're a part of the so-called nation. You talk about trade, you talked about exporting materials to Africa. Well, what if the materials or the services you plan to export to Africa run up again against NAFTA agreements? This is what we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen. Serious issues. It is time for African American people to get over our ignorance. You got to read more than books written by black folk because the books are not covering enough territory. You cannot let yourself be deceived by people who tell you simply because books are written by white folk, you should not read them. White folk don't write every book to deceive black folk. They don't write every book with you in mind. Why do black people have problems reading? Because they're not taught well in school? Not really. The problems black people have with reading has nothing to do with academia. What are we saying here? The problem that we have with reading as a people is a political problem that expresses itself in school as an academic problem. What do I mean by that? I mean by that there is so much information in America. Real information, factual information, information everywhere you look, free-flowing information. So in order for us to be ignorant, we have to will ourselves to be ignorant. In a sense, we must be dumb in America in order not to take advantage of the information available to us. In other words, there is so much information available that if we truly could read as a people, and I'm not talking about technical reading, there are those who have great vocabularies who still can't read. We truly must not be interested in reading in order for this information to flow around us the way it does. In other words, we have to fall asleep over our books. We have to get headaches when we read. We have to lack interest in reading. We have to, if we are men, see reading as a feminine activity, as something that we are not supposed to do, as something that's exclusively the right of white boys. In other words, these kinds of attitudes must be psychologically and politically induced in the black mind so that whites can enjoy freedom of speech and lay out every means, line by line and chapter by chapter, of how they rule African people and maintain us in subordination. This is what it's about, and it's here, and it's available for us. And yet we are not availing ourselves to the information. We are entering into an age now where the wars are not the wars so much which involve military might, but what we call econo-wars. Wars of economy, where nations will be defeated and destroyed as effectively by their economic positions and struggles as they used to be defeated in terms of military struggles. Ronald Reagan and the white conservatives made up their minds years ago that they would destroy Russia not in terms of dropping bombs on Russia, but that they would spin Russia into the ground. And what they would do would keep escalating the cost of weapons and keep escalating military budgets. And as the Russians sought to keep up with them in military spending, ultimately Russia would collapse economically. And that is exactly what happened, and the Russian Empire fell apart. And today Clinton is in Russia getting ready to feed on that nation like vultures. And the Eastern Europeans, who were a part of the so-called Warsaw Pact, now want to join NATO. Why? Because of the wars of economics. And these nations are now teaming up to make war against African nations and African people. We can talk then about the regional agreement between Asian nations, and African nations are not a part of those agreements. We can talk about the regional agreements in Latin America. They're now setting up Chile, and they're now setting up Argentina to be the next members of the NAFTA Accords. In other words, ultimately, the United States will wrap in the whole of Central and South America into the NAFTA club, along with Canada. Where are the Caribbean Africans in this situation? In other words, then, we see Europe creating a community of nations. And we see ultimately Europe uniting with Eastern Europe and the other parts of Europe. We will ultimately see Islamic nations creating economic blocs. And where then are the African blocs, and where is the Pan-African economic system? We got Negroes over here singing "We Shall Overcome" and talking about they're a part of some multicultural society and talking about diversity in the workplace. Getting over ethnicity when the whole world is combining in terms of ethnicity. But this is the game. This is the game we've fallen for century after century. People talking one thing and doing another. And now we see that the African Americans are being isolated in this very nation. We are now more segregated in this nation than we were in the 1920s. You read here recently that the level of segregation of black children, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, is now at its, in schools, is now back at its 1960s levels. We have reached the point where the black male is essentially economically obsolete and useless. And this is at the bottom of this war that's getting ready to develop on the black male. I warned you in on black violence that this whole issue about crime in the black community was but a setup, a rationalization for the genocidal attack against the black community. I warned you on black violence that if you really looked at the statistics, the greatest crooks and criminals in America are American white men. That this nation is a criminal nation. It is a supreme mafia. You heard me say that earlier. You heard me say that this nation has been at the center of wars that have destroyed within the 20th century some 167 million people. And yet they have convinced you that the threat to the world is the black male and the black drug dealer, as if the threat to the life of the world is in the hands of black men. You could have 10,000 black men on these streets every night, mugging 100 people apiece, and you would never begin to equal the number of people killed and destroyed by white males. But yet they're convincing you that a black male is a criminal. And what am I saying then? In order for us to be in the condition we're in, we have to literally return backwards. The victims of criminality have to be made to appear to be the criminals, and the criminals made to appear to be victims. When you talk about drug addiction, you're made to think that this is a major problem in the black community, and it is, but it's much more a major problem in the white community. Definitely. But why are we made to believe that we are the bulk of the drug addicts? Why are we made to believe that we generate the bulk of violent crime? In every criminal category, you will see that white males outrank black males. Just as in every welfare category, you will see white folk far exceeding black folk in numbers. In every area where people talk about entitlements, you will find that it is the white middle class and the white upper class that gets the largest bulk of government money. But yet when you hear the term entitlement programs, you automatically think of black folk. And yet when you hear the terms of welfare, you automatically think of black folk. And yet when you hear the term of violence and criminality, you automatically think what? Black folk. Yet whites are not unfamiliar with the actual figures. They have them. It means then, ladies and gentlemen, when a people ignores a set of facts, when they insist in the face of the facts, in believing in opposition to the facts, then the issue is not about truth. We have some people in our community who believe that if they keep telling white folk the truth, they're going to transform the American situation. We're going to talk truth to power. You're going to talk truth to power, all right, and get crushed for talking it. Why didn't the people tell the emperor he had no clothes? Because they recognized that telling him the truth placed them in danger. Only a naive child would talk truth and get away with it. So the issue is not